Okay, thank you, Lori. Hey, honey, washte mitaku yapi. That's Lakota for meaning good morning, my relatives. And in the traditional Native way of addressing, they use relationship terms rather than proper names. Proper names are, a lot of them were assigned during early reservation times by non-Native peoples. And then their descendants would therefore inherit the name. The generations going onward. But usually those names may sound Indian, but they're really not. Like Archie Fire Lame Deer was a friend of mine who's passed on now. But Fire Lame Deer, they gave that name to him because when his ancestors was coming up to be put on the rolls, a fire broke out, and the guy writing it down said, "Oh, we'll just call you Fire Lame Deer." And their real names are really given to them spiritually. So they'll have a name that may sound Indian, but was more of an assigned name that is just used out in public. And then their actual name is usually only used ceremonially. And other than that, we're just talking about the traditional people on these reservations and also in the cities, those who are traditional. So they'll refer to you in more like in a relationship term. And for me, coming from Kansas City, and when I go up there, I'm still thinking Kansas City. So I'm still thinking, well, yeah, your name's John, and your name's Paul, and your name's Margaret, and that kind of thing. And so one day I was up at the Sundance, and somebody hollered, "Uncle." I just kept walking, because I'd just gotten up there. And then it dawned on me that, oops, I'm here around traditional people. So I turned around, and it was an adopted nephew of mine who was addressing me that way. So when I said, "Hey, honey, mitaku yapi," I was addressing everybody as a relative, because that goes back to the beginning of the universe, where we all came from the same place and we're all related. We're all relatives. And so it's typical to address each other as a relative. So we ended last week with the story of Washaka. And there are a lot of layered meanings to that story. And I did about 1/5 of the book. Partly time limitations and partly because it made the point one to make about nurturing and how children are raised in the society in the old days. Now that's not true today. As a matter of fact, I was up on the Rosebud Reservation year before last, and there was a mission up there at St. Francis, a little town of St. Francis, and it's named after the mission. And they have a museum at that mission school. And so I was in the museum and going through there, and I saw some chinoopas. That's what Lakota's name for pipe, used for ceremonies. And there are three things that are in the tradition mixed in there, and for tobacco, what we call tobacco: chashasha, red willow bark, osha root. Red willow bark's about 50%, osha root 25%, and actual tobacco is a 25% mix, and put into the pipe or chinoopa. Now, Chinoopa really means the unification of masculine and feminine. So when you put that Chinoopa together, it's a representation of the masculine and feminine energy in the universe. So there was a young man working behind the counter, a full-blooded Lakota, I could tell, and he may have been 20 at the most, but he's in the Jesuit mission and probably went through the mission schools there. So I asked him if he would show me the Chinoopa. There's a Chinoopa I had a particular interest I wanted to talk about, and he didn't know what I was talking about. So I said, could I ask you about the Chinoopa over there? And he said, he didn't know. Finally I said, the pipe. He said, oh, okay. Then he took me over, we walked over there. So it tells you something about, even on reservations, there are people that don't even know their most fundamental traditions. You know, you'll find that because of the pressures of the non-native world have been so great. And a lot of these people have been in boarding schools and so on. So one of the values of Washeka is because it reminds the people up there of who they are. Because the loss of culture also, you lose your self-identity and lose who you are. And it just shows you how extensive some of this is. So that's why when I'm talking about people up there and people I know, and people, adopted relatives I've had up there, I always say the traditional people, because there's a big distinction there between the traditionals and the others. For example, on the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation, there are 4 different Lakota languages, if you can believe that. One, there still has traditional peoples who speak in the older language. Of course, every languages are dynamic, so they change by nature. But that group that still speaks the traditional language, the parts of it have changed and not changed. Then there's the Jesuit Lakota language, where the Jesuits kind of forced their interpretations onto the Lakota. I'll give you an example. Unshimala, in the traditional ways, means it's addressing the needs of your community. So the Jesuits came in and changed the meaning to I am pitiful. So there are actually people up there that know the Jesuit meaning, I'm pitiful, and not the original Lakota meaning that my community has needs that we want to address. So you get a lot of that. Then there's an Episcopalian Lakota language. And then there's a contemporary slang language spoken in Indian. So you have all this mixture on the reservation that creates kind of a sense of disconnect, even among people within that community. So the lessons of Washeka are really important because it brings out these different layers of nurturance and things like that. So the children are very important. They come to this, most of you heard of Tatanka Iotake, which translates as Sitting Bull on Papa Lakota. Let us put our minds together and see what life we can make for our children. And that kind of counters a lot of the Hollywood images that one may get from about Sitting Bull and other native peoples like Crazy Horse and so on. This would be their primary first thought in a socio-political meeting. The focus on children's well-being forces the socio-political system into a more expansive thought process. So in the old days, and this is not happening today, but in the old days, when socio-political decisions were brought out in council meetings, the number one consideration was the well-being of the children, as well as those unborn. In other words, they felt a responsibility for protecting the environment so that the people who are not here yet would also have a place, a healthy place to live. So this far-sighted sense of this idea of expanding the thought process in your decision-making process was considered to be very important. So this is a real fascinating area, linguistics. And one of the world's premier linguists is Noam Chomsky at MIT. And Noam Chomsky comes up with just this fascinating idea. As one of the world's leading linguists, the structure of language determines not only thought, but reality itself. And as I was thinking, and I do not speak Lakota, I know pieces and bits, and sometimes I can understand somebody who's speaking, I can kind of put together what they're saying. So often they're speaking so fast and my thought process is so slow that they get way ahead of me as I'm trying to adjust my thought into that language. So I'm not a current speaker, although I know some Lakota, like what I addressed this morning earlier and so on. But what I do know, what Noam Chomsky said really hits the nail on the head. Because you learn to see through your first language. And no matter what else you learn, your brain immediately goes to the first language. For example, the Lakota word for residence or place of residence in the old days was teepee. Now, the non-native world borrowed that word and applied it to all Plains Indian tribes out there, whether you're Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, or whatever. They expanded that term to all that, but it actually is a Lakota word. When somebody says teepee to me, my brain immediately goes to lodge poles and covering. My brain sees a lodge and a cover, and so it's very physical. Their brain doesn't go there. It goes to the space within where the relationships all occur. And they might go to the poles and the cover secondarily, but their brain immediately goes to the space inside that area captures, that space that's captured. And so even though I know that, my brain will not go there. I have to remind myself to remember that, because immediately my brain goes to my first language and so on. So I think Noam Chomsky and his statements are extremely fascinating. And I'm thinking that that's a field that could be specialized in, because if you really want to learn the culture and how that culture sees, look at the language, which I think is really, really significant. Noam Chomsky is retired in 2002 there. So he's Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT. So I put in here a few examples, excuse me, as to how different these native languages are. The first word in there I put Tunkanshila, Tunkanshila. It means grandfather. But what's interesting about words in Lakota is that every syllable you can split away from that word, and that syllable stands alone as a separate meaning. Which is typical. I asked my friend from Santa Domingo, Pueblo, south of Santa Fe, and he verified that's kind of how their language operates as well. And it's a completely different language, but it's still indigenous, still native. So Tun Kanshila, grandfather. Tun means the birth. It takes you all the way back to 13 to 14 billion years ago, the beginning of the entire universe. So Tun Kan means birth of all energy, which is dualistic. And if you think about atoms, atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, electrons. The electrons revolve around the nucleus, and they produce a negative charge. The protons are in the nucleus itself, and they provide a positive charge. So you have this positive-negative duality that's created in the universe, and that's what our bodies are made up of. The tree I'm looking out in my backyard here is also made of atoms like that, and so on. So Tunka means the beginning of everything, that dualistic energy. Shala means an acknowledgement that I am one with that all. Hence, well, I was going to say something else. I'll drop back a little bit. So what's fascinating about this concept? If you have these languages, which you put several syllables together and you come up with a meaning, but you can deconstruct those syllables, and each syllable can stand alone with a separate meaning. And to me, when I look at what Noam Chomsky is saying here, it's just, it just kind of blows me away when you think of how that would shift, how you would see everything. So underneath that, the combined standalone syllables create inclusivity, or an inclusive thought process. When you think about how that would operate and how your brain would function, it shifts things into an inclusivity, a sense of inclusivity. And I'll skip back and then I'll come back to that slide. But that just makes me think of this word, Maitake, which means all my relatives, means we're all one. That is foundational to Lakota and most American Indian spirituality, that we're really all one. We're all coming from the same source of energy that began 13 to 14 billion years ago. So coming down further, maybe even more fascinating is the word below that, Wiya. Now, Wiya is 2 syllables. The Wiya, we stands for the sun. Iya stands for the earth. Combining those 2 words, the sun and the earth, you've gotten the unification of all the energy coming from both the sun and the earth, this reconciliation of all that energy coming together. And so all that energy that merges together is the source of everything that is organic, whether it's a tree, a bird, a human being, a blade of grass, an insect. That relationship between the sun and the earth, that unification of energy, is what creates everything that is alive. Wiya. The Lakota word in English, or the translation into English of Wiya, is woman. Can you see the native thought about why that would be woman? Because it is the women who create the next generation by giving birth. But beyond just giving birth, women have a natural tendency towards nurturance. The feminine side of who we are has a natural tendency towards nurturance. So by combining the words for sun and the words for earth, in the native mind, yeah, that's woman, because she not only creates life for our community, she also nurtures that life. So that gives you some insight as to what Chomsky's really saying here, that your sense of what is real comes from your first language, not your second language or third or fourth, but your first language. It's just like my example for teepee. My brain will not go to the native view of what a teepee is. My brain will just go to the physical aspects of it, still to this day, even though I know better. So I also created a sentence here as another example. Shuka wakan ki ota wachalawa yelo. Now, what you have, Shuka wakan is their word for horse. Kiota, the word ota means plenty, wachalawa, we have. So literally translating that in the Lakota syntax, and the organization of how the words come in a sentence is critical to shifting the meaning. Horses plenty we have is the Lakota syntax for Shuka wakan ki ota wachalawa yelo. Now, if I translate into the English, I have to change the syntax and also change the meaning of plenty to many. So we have many horses. Now this shifting the, putting the subject of the sentence first focuses on the ego. Putting the object of the sentence first forces the brain to focus on outcomes. It causes the brain to focus on outcome, to focus the brain on community orientation. So the thought process goes to community. I think this is just absolutely fascinating. And the first time I really began to think about that in some detail with Lakota was when I began to learn a little bit more about Noam Chomsky and how he was analyzing linguistics from other cultures. And when I saw what Noam Chomsky was saying and what he was talking about, it just about blew my mind away. And I thought, my God, what a great field to study in anthropology if you really get in here and begin to analyze linguistics, because it changes everything about how people think and respond. So from all that comes Maitake Wiase. Everything in this universe is my relative. We're all related. Hence, I started the class this morning with Hehane Washte Maitake Yapi. Good morning, my relatives. So with that in mind, their native spirituality and life in the old days and among traditionals cannot be separated. The life, your life and your spirituality is one thing, not two separate things. And a lot of that comes from the language. And you know, just their ceremonialism and that kind of thing. So with Maitake, we're all one. Native spirituality is not a form of worship. And that's a real critical point to make. Native spirituality is not a form of worship. It was, the reason I put past tense in there, because this is only this way today with those who have stayed with their traditions and have been able to, through all the chaos in their lives, have been able to hang on to the tradition. So it was the oneness of the universe is their understanding. So as you see yourself as part of a whole, there's no longer a sense of worship, because that implies looking, excuse me, looking to a separate entity. So Wachakia, given that situation, Wachakia gets translated by the Jesuits as prayer. But it's not really prayer. What Wachakia literally means is to acknowledge and to address certain spiritual forces out in that oneness. So it's not totally, prayer is maybe the best English word you can put to it, but we're dealing with cultures here that are so vastly different, you know, in the whole process, how they process or used to process information and so on. So to try to get into that cultural lens is pretty critical to really understanding. So the process of Wachakia is, since I'm all one with everything, including that spirit world out there, if I'm trying to make a choice or a decision about something, I make a choice based on my best understanding of the best choice. And once I've made that choice, then I come in and ask those spiritual forces out there to come in and support me. But I make the choice first. And once I've made the choice, then I ask for spiritual help. And if I've made a choice that's in line of balance and harmony and sustainability, that I will be supported. If my choice is off the track, I probably won't be supported. So you have a whole nother way of this spirituality. So when I use the word spirituality, that's really what I'm referring to and what is generally referred to. It's a very complex set of process of mental relationships, or seeing how your relationships function in this universe. It's a whole nother way of seeing how relationships function. So this brings me to two Western psychologists, Erik Erikson and Abraham Maslow. And Erikson's professor of psychology, or was professor of psychology at Harvard, UC Berkeley, and Yale. And some of you may have heard him, maybe if you studied psychology or went into the field of education. In your studies, you probably would have studied about Erik Erikson. Discovered that community role development, tribal rituals, and cultural practices had once afforded a sense of identity to each member. Their traditional lifestyle had served as a guide through life. Maslow created his pyramid of self-actualization. Now, Maslow was a professor of psychology, Harvard, UC Berkeley, Yale. A master's degree, University of Wisconsin, and continued research at Columbia. But he also went into the Blackfeet reservations and studied there and spent quite a bit of time among the Blackfoot people. And through that, he developed Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Is a motivational theory in psychology comprising a 5-tier model of human needs. And the final need at the very top, self-actualization, the building of self-esteem. That's kind of what we were referring to the other day as inside out training, like Washaka. The idea of Washaka is to build a strong sense of self through a nurturing process. Maslow felt an empathic connection with the Blackfoot. His experience with them influenced his belief in an innate positivity in human beings and pointed towards a more benevolent form of society. This inspired him to think in terms of a new kind of biologically rooted humanistic psychology. And I got that from Psychology Today, May 2019. So thinking about Washaka and how they treated those 11-year-old boys, and think about the linguistics and how your first language shifts your lens and shifts your thought process into a whole nother process. And these two psychologists who have looked at this and have come to some of these ideas. The picture on the left that you see, tribal, nurtures into self-awareness and independence, inside out, whole brain focus. And what I liked about this picture, you see the elder standing behind the child. And the child already knows what to do. The child doesn't have to follow the elder's lead to figure out what to do. She's already been raised in a nurturing way that she has a deep sense of self-awareness and inside out. Now, I'm coming from, my career has been in education as a teacher in high school and also later on in college. So I found this picture in contrast. State shapes citizens to serve the economy and institutions, outside in, left brain focus. And that kind of recalls back to Carol Quigley that we've talked about several times over the last few weeks. And I quoted Carol Quigley down here, producing society with an instrument of expansion. So over the years, I came to realize that what we were doing was teaching students to fit into a society that was already there. And of course, Native peoples did similar, but they approached it in opposite directions. And so on the left-hand side, we have this, I kind of coined the phrase, inside out. On the left-hand side, outside in training. And when I think about my growing up years, like I mentioned last week, the refrain I was constantly reminded of, what will people think? As a little child, I began my training to always look outside of me. And I feel, you know, since I've gotten into all this, and over the last, especially the last 40 years, I realized that the sense of who I am was pretty weak because I relied on outside of me to try to define myself. Like I would go to a gathering of people and I'm being introduced to somebody I didn't know. I was always asked one question. That question, what do you do? You know, like, what do you do for a living? And of course I'd say, well, I'm in education. And you know, this constant reminders of the outside in. So then I thought of a funny slide to be a comedy like. I don't know how many of you saw Animal House back in, I believe, 1978. Okay, I should scroll through here and see if I got one hand up. Okay. Anyway, Animal House was an interesting movie. So when I looked at these two slides, Animal House popped into my mind. And so here we are. We have the band marching down the street, and suddenly a fraternity brother rushes over and grabs a baton out of the band leader. And he takes the baton and marches the band right into an alley and right into a blank wall. And the band just keeps marching into that blank wall. I don't know how many of you remember seeing that, but when I was thinking about outside in training, my brain went to that movie. Wow, you know, I just thought it was funny. But that Animal House was quite an interesting movie, to say the least. Follow the leader, and in this case, it was follow the baton, and the whole band just went right into the alley. So using that kind of as a comparison, the tribal people had a form of democracy based on consensus building, not voting. And the result of consensus building was a bottom-up system. It was lineage-based, and because you have such a broad distribution of power here, there was no really development of a highly centralized form of government. And the basis of power in these tribal organizations was not a chief, was not a president, or a speaker of the house, or anything like that. The centralization, there was no centralization of power because the power base was the lineage, was your extended family group, was your power base. And each extended family group came to a consensus and then sent a representative to the tribal councils. So you don't have a real centralization of power. And that way they were able to have a system of consensus building which gave every citizen in there a sense of deep responsibility. And the issue there, I have a question about that. If you did not raise your people, the children, into adulthood like Washeka was raised, in other words, in this nurturing, rather complex nurturing system, would a bottom-up form of democracy work? Because I see this as all having a connection, that since these children were all raised into adulthood, through a nurturing process, these systems worked very well. Now, I'm drawing a state kind of comparison because we've been talking about this formation of states going all the way back to ancient China, Greece, India, and so on, and even further back, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and on. So the consensus building, what we have today when the founding fathers came over and then constructed the government, there's a debate as to how much American Indian influence had on the founding fathers. So there's a lot of evidence that Ben Franklin was deeply influenced. Rutledge out of Carolinas was deeply influenced. Several others, even some by Jefferson and so on. And I've got a whole series of books that just deal with that studying about the influence and so on. But I also want to mention, in regard to that, there is a segment of scholarly work that disagrees that they had any influence, that all the influence came from England. So there is a debate among scholars about the level of influence American Indian democracies had on the founding fathers. The leading, I'll give you the leading anti-influence scholar, and she's very much a scholar, is Elizabeth Toker. Now, if you want to look her up, she doesn't deal with this that much. She's more interested in Iroquois, the structure of the society and so on. But she does, as a sidelight, strike out against the scholars that believe Native peoples had a lot of influence. Obviously, I'm going to go with the scholars that believe in the influence, but I thought I'd give you an opposing view at the same time. And if you want to look up Elizabeth Toker and see what she has to say, she's a very highly educated woman, and she goes into a very good description of Iroquois society and so on. But the one area I disagree with her on is that area. So, but she has a sense of logic about, she believes England was significant and so on. But what we have on the right-hand side is what came out of a state thought process, a state socio-political system. And the founding fathers, if you'll remember contextually, the background they're coming from is monarchy. Now, we go through the Tudor kings, we go through the Stuarts, and because of time limitations, I can't deal with any of this very much. The Tudors and the Stuarts basically believed in divine right rule. And then the Stuarts were run off. I'm really skipping over a lot of good history here. There's a rebellion against the Stuarts, and the Stuart James II went into well, he left the monarchy, and William and Mary came in. William was from the Netherlands, but married to a Stuart. Mary was a Stuart herself. And they came in. Well, the reason I'm bringing William and Mary up is because in 1689, I believe William and Mary came to the throne in 88, 89, right in there. But in 89, they produced what is known as the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights is significant because it's a policy statement coming out of William and Mary. And a lot of people will argue, okay, this proves that England was a democracy. But what was actually happening, you have a rising commercial class is becoming more and more significant and their voice more and more significant. Which in that context, it was wise to come up with a policy statement that William did as he did that. But if you go a little bit deeper, you'll find that William and Mary did not change the English administration from the Stuart Kings. The administration stayed the same, with the same people holding basically the same offices. And also interesting, William and Mary did not do away with the punishment of drawing and quartering as punishment for sedition against England. They kept that in place. There's examples of how that happened over here in New York and so on. So there's an interesting thing here that we see happening with the Founding Fathers. What are they trying to achieve? They're trying to achieve a separation from a monarchy which is struggling to maintain power against a growing commercial class in England. And they're trying to really maintain absolute authority in the light of this growing commercial class, which is putting a lot of pressure into the society. So the Founding Fathers are coming in with this contextual mentality. And they're thinking about, okay, how can we develop a system of government that will give us more power and will weaken a centralized kind of government? And looking at native cultures, I'm not sure they fully understood what was going on in the native cultures with this consensus building concept. Even though Ben Franklin attended meetings with these people and conferences in Albany, New York, I'm thinking about one there and some other ones in Rutledge and so on. I think their mindset was, let's have more power and let's weaken the centralization process. And that's what they did. So by developing a breakdown into countervailing forces, we have the three divisions of government that they broke down, which would counter the rise. Remember, we talked about Lord Acton earlier. Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. They're aware of this idea. So the idea was to prevent the corruption, perhaps we can redistribute the power. They didn't go near as far as tribal people, but they did modify it somewhat and break that down. But we still wind up with a top-down power structure. And then you put in economic power, or the economics, and then we get this big class division, which are already solidly established during this time period. If you look at the wealth of the Founding Fathers compared to, for example, we talked about yesterday the indentured servants and when they were freed and where do they go now and this kind of thing. You're really seeing the formation of this power structure coming from basically the aristocratic class of people. So So what we have is really a modification with the division, this power division into three different groups of people. And we're still coming from an outside in people. People like me, what will people think? You know, that's what I grew up with. I think we're still coming from that kind of thought process. So to me, the psychological aspects of this, the historic context, even bringing in William and Mary, I think is critical. Understanding the thought process of the founding fathers and where they were coming from. I think it's critical in looking at people like Elizabeth Poker, the scholar that opposes the idea of native influence, as well as the scholars who agree with it. So to put all that into context, I think that's what makes history so absolutely fascinating, to see these different factors that come in. Now, because of our time being short, I'm just going to throw this out, but not much detail. Responsibility, community well-being. The founding fathers came up with the Bill of Rights. In Rhode Island, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, Rhode Island was the last to ratify the Bill of Rights in 1790. Thus, putting in place finally the entire Constitution at its beginning. The Bill of Rights, the Constitution was ratified before the Bill of Rights were finished. And so then each of the 13 states then had to ratify the Bill of Rights. And Rhode Island was the last one to ratify it in 1790. And you're probably already aware of a lot of what's in the Bill of Rights. So because of time limitations, I'm not going to go over this slide in great detail. But this versus the sense of tribal responsibility. Like the founding fathers could have come up with a Bill of Responsibility instead of a Bill of Rights. And it could be argued that a Bill of Responsibilities may have been more effective than a Bill of Rights. Because if you're raised to take responsibility for the well-being of your community, just like we talked about in linguistics, studying linguistics and how the brain thinks, and you have all these layers that these children were raised into, your rights would already be taken care of. This is just fascinating ways of beginning to see how history kind of operates, you know, the dynamics of history, which I think makes history really an exciting topic. When you begin to look at all these dynamics that come together to do this. So to remember that the founding fathers are coming out of a context. They're living in a different world. And this is how they are seeing the best way to go. And I don't know how many of you have read Howard Zinn's history, but it's fascinating too. He has a different interpretation on what happened also. It's a fascinating, another fascinating look at history. If any of you would like to get, Howard Zinn is a little different. He takes a different approach and comes up with some different ideas and so on, which is interesting. So taking responsibility as opposed to a Bill of Rights and so on. So this is another slide I need to go through really quick. We talked a lot about relationship orientation. And when I said, hey, honey, watch they Maitake yapi, my relatives, when we've been talking about relationship orientation, it's that, you know, when a relationship orientation is just two words, well, that's kind of interesting, let's move on. But when you begin to see how it functioned in these tribal societies, for example, there are really 4 different words for the word cousin. Is it a girl cousin or boy cousin? Is it an older cousin or younger cousin? And there are different words which define different relationship protocols. Older brother in Lakota is Chia. Younger brother is Misu. Different words, different kind of behavioral protocols in that relationship. So we talk about a relationship-oriented people. It goes really fundamental and deep as to how these societies operated and worked. And object-oriented, for example, I like to point out down here where it says use of relationship terms instead of proper names: brother, auntie, uncle, grandfather. Instead of using Gil, the boy that called me that day at the Sundance, he said uncle. He didn't say Gil. Had he said Gil, I would have turned around. You know, and said, oh yeah, I'd forgotten I was in a traditional ceremony on an Indian reservation for that split second. I forgot that, you know. So, but the differences here, we would use proper names like Fred and Janice and so on. And it goes on to that comparison. By the way, the picture on the object orientation side is our beautiful city, downtown Kansas City, Missouri. So what is power? When we get into all this, then we begin to see power differently. So in a relationship-oriented society, well, I'm calling, say, the young man there's holding the little girl, I might call him nephew instead of Peter Bluebear or whatever it might be. You know, I might say nephew. Relationship-oriented societies tend to see power as spiritual. Object-oriented societies tend to define the use of force and leverage as power. Who's the most powerful person in the world? Sometimes I hear people saying, well, the President of the United States. In the traditional Native society, that wouldn't mean that at all. So then we come, I just picked one group of people, and again, because of time limitations, I'll be very brief here. The Osage, because if you live south of the river on the Missouri side, you're in Osage country. And their real name for themselves is Waunkanshka-Wazaze. Osage is a foreign name, but most of them will use it because that's what communicates. But Waunkanshka-Wazaze means people of the middle waters. And the Kansa Indians, their name for themselves is Kansa-Nakashima, which means people of the south wind. We got the name of Kansas from them, Kansa-Nakashima. And the word Ka comes from Nakashima, shortened Ka, Nakashima. Kansas comes from Kansa, Kansa-Nakashima. So the Neo-Kanshka-Wazaze, the Osage people, this is a typical tribal organization that you would find all over the Midwest up to the Great Lakes, except for the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people. So the figures you see lined up and down at the bottom all represent clans or lineages. And the figures on the top represent clans or lineages. And this is where their housing would be. This is how the housing would be organized. And then you would have a space in the middle. So each clan represents certain powers in the universe, and all their songs and their images that they use represent those powers. And let me give you an example. If you can see this, Lori, can everybody see what I'm putting up here in front? Let me see.
We can see, sort of, yeah. It looks like something with feathers go up some.
Okay. How's that?
Good. Now pull back a little bit.
Is that better?
That's better. We can't see the whole thing, but it's definitely better. Okay. Yep. Perfect.
Now you got it?
Yep.
Okay, I don't know if you can see. This is Osage. It's maybe 130 years old, 20, somewhere in there. And it's a hairdress. Men would wear this. It's colored red and black. And in the old days, the red was deer hair and the black was turkey beard. You know, male turkeys with a beard hanging down from their chest. But since this was made, the turkeys had almost disappeared. The endangered species at that point. And so they had to replace that with horsetail or horsehair. Well, it's a headgear, but remember, life and spirituality are inseparable. So the headpiece represents the tribal governance, and it represents council fire, the council fire of the tribal council. It would be the same equivalency maybe as the flag would be in our case. And the council fire, you got the red representing the council fire, and the smoke is the black. So if you're wearing that, you're out there representing your people. Basically, is what that means. But it also means, it's got layered meanings. It also means the sunrise and the sunset. The sunrise in the red, the sunset in the black. And because of that, it means life's journey. The Lakota word Zuya means your life's journey. So if you look back at the, the sunset and sunrise, if a man is wearing this, and you're in a Native American culture, they see that, they know exactly what that means. It's not just a hair decoration. It's interpretive, and they know exactly what it means. Even tribes that are not part of the Osage or Osage would know exactly what that means. So let's take back a look at the graph again. You see the dotted line in between. The people below the dotted line are from what is known as anthropology, would call that the earth moiety. The word moiety in anthropology means the tribe is divided into two groups or moieties. That controls marriage patterns. Then if you go above that dotted line, that's the sky moiety. So when you combine that, remember we mentioned the word Wia or woman, which means all the energy merging from the sky and the earth together. That's woman. That's what you have going on here with the Osage tribal organization here. This is a single Osage town, and they would all be set up like this. So each lineage has a physical representative. I'm just going to throw one out here. The bear image. Let's say the sky, the one above the dotted line, let's say the sky has an image. Let's say I'll just say robin, a bird robin image. I'm just making that up. But it could be eagle, it could be hawk, it could be any image. How about the morning star clan? It could be a morning star clan. So you have all of these together. each one of these lineages has their own ceremonies and their own songs, and they're different. So as each image on here goes through, you have all the energy of the entire universe represented, with each clan representing their piece of it. Now, this sounds interesting too, that every morning before sunup, members of each clan stand out in front of their housing, and a clan may have more than one house. And they have certain ceremonies they perform. And the man on the left is a clan member and a clan leader, and his face is painted, which represents his specific powers that his clan has, which represents that little piece of the universe. And they may have over 100 songs to that. The man on the right leads the whole process, and he sits over here in the middle of the right in the east. And look at his face decoration. You have at the top 4 lines coming down, which represent the powers that come out of the different parts of the universe. And then you have the lines going down, framing his face in. That represents our time on this earth as a living being. And to the Osage, that means you are only allowed so much knowledge. So in a sense, you're trapped. As a human being, you're in a certain, trap or snare or whatever, because you can only have the knowledge that your 5 senses give you, with one exception. Your medicine people can get beyond those 2 lines coming down, framing his face in. They can get up into those 4 on his forehead and into that spiritual realm and those spiritual forces. So he sits here in the east, and he makes sure everything goes smoothly. So they start every morning before sunup, and they welcome the sun into the day, which is their word for east. Maitake in Lakota means where the sun enters the day. And they do this every morning. And then they do it every night when the sun goes down. So back to the hair roach that you see, it represents all that. If a man is wearing that on his head. So when we say life to these people in the old days, and spirituality is inseparable. It is the same thing. There is no separation between the two. There's a lot more to talk about there, but I think I better move on. It gives you an idea of the level of development of these people and how they were organized. So coming back here, I picked Leon Shenandoah, Totadaho, Haudenosaunee, Onondaga people. In other words, we call them the Iroquois. Is a league of Iroquois nations. There are 6. Haudenosaunee means people of the longhouse. So you have a picture of the longhouse with 6 smoke holes there to represent each of the Indian nations that are part of the Iroquois people. The Totadaho is like the head of the council of the League of Nations. He's the one, and they meet at Onondaga once a year. They still do to this day. And the Totadaho is the head of that council. So Leon Shenandoah makes this statement: humans are not capable of power. Only the spirit has power. Humans are capable of strength, and the source of human strength is gentleness. This is a person who's a friend of adopted relatives I had up at the Lake Andes Dakota Indian Reservation. Her name is Faith Spotted Eagle, and she's a Hunktawa, Dakota. Yeah, thank you. In the old days, they said that you were measured by your generosity, not how much money you earned. You were measured by how you could feed the people, how you could house them, how you could take care of them. John Trudell, Santee, Dakota, we are a spirit. We are a natural part of the earth. And all of our ancestors, all of our relations who have gone to the spirit world, they are here with us. That's power. It's a different kind of definition altogether. This person was one of the most powerful, spiritually powerful. Now we're defining power in the Indian way, not in the non-native way. So when I say he was powerful, that means he had such great spiritual power during his lifetime. Maybe the most powerful man in the 20th century among the Dakota people. Grandpa Fool's Crow, everybody called him Grandpa. Survival of the world depends on our sharing what we have, a working together. If we don't, the whole world will die. First the planet, and next the people. I visited Grandpa Fool's Crow twice. And when I got to his home on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, it was a 2-room house, bedroom, living room. And in the living room was an old wood heating fireplace like oven, and a little kind of kitchenette-like thing in his living room. That was his possession. That was where he lived. And when I visited him, I had just gotten a chinumpa, in other words, a pipe that you pray with or you do the washakia with. And I wanted him to bless it. So I had never met him before, but I'd heard of him for a long time because he's one of the most revered people among the Lakota peoples from all different reservations. And so I sat down in a chair and he sat down in a chair facing me. And he looked at me. And I had a feeling I'd never felt before. When he looked at me, I felt he saw way beyond me. You know, we all have a front stage and backstage. The front stage is what we show, even to the people we care the most about. But we have a little tiny space that's very personal, we don't share with anyone. I had the feeling he saw all of it. And normally, I might be frightened. I might even really rebel, really feel, no, you can't see that piece. But his eyes were so gentle and kind. I didn't care that he saw that. And these native spiritual people never ask for a dime. I've been in a lot of ceremonies, healing ceremonies, different reservations, different people. I have never once been asked or heard anyone charge money. If somebody charges you money for something, get out of there fast. Because I've never, no native person has ever asked me, even hinted that they wanted anything in return. For no matter what they do for you in a spiritual way. And so, but you know, you do have a responsibility, and so you do wind up giving them something if they help you in some way. The second time I was there, they were having a sun dance, and he's been reputed to be 103 years old when he passed on. I don't know how old he really was. I don't think anybody really knew, including him. But there was a guy up there on a Humblachia. That's what we call a vision quest. And he was laughing because this guy had had gone out, and when he gathered material for the vision quest or Humblachia, you always put a choke tree up there facing the west. And this guy found the biggest choke tree he could find with the most leaves on it to put up there because he thought he could hide from the sun. He's out there all day. And that night, the wind came along and blew all the leaves off of it. And so Grandpa Fool's Crow was just laughing. He said that wind came and blew all the leaves off of it so the sun can still get to it. There's another one. He wrote a book called Zuya, Albert Whitehat Sr. He died about 3 years ago. As a teacher at Sintagaliska University in South Dakota, Sintagaliska means spotted tail. Whitehat seeks to preserve the link Lakota people have with their past. In life's journey, Zuya, Whitehat has collected and translated the stories of medicine men, retaining the simplicity of the language so as not to interpret their words through a Western lens. This is Zuya, oral history that is lived and handed down over the generations. It's another book I would recommend if you wanted to go deeper into this. But he was a linguist professor at Sintagaliska, and classes taught in Lakota, because Lakotas, some of them just don't know their own language, and so that's one of the things that they were doing. So coming back, pulling this kind of together a little bit, inclusivity versus exclusivity. And my question becomes, looking at Noam Chomsky, the question becomes, is the language, the way it's divided up into syllables, independent meanings coming together to make a whole meaning? What role does that play, or did that play, in how a person would view their universe? How would they view their sense of inclusivity? It's obviously the religion or spirituality was extremely inclusive. I think it partly explains why in North America, in US, Canada, tribes never engaged in massive warfares where thousands were slaughtered in a single day. Their idea of warfare was raiding. And seldom was the object of a raid to kill the enemy. And certainly before the invasion started, where there was pressure to keep moving west, before that, there was almost never exchange of territory or occupying somebody else's territory. I wonder, and this is just my theory, I'm theorizing and so on, or hypothesizing, what did linguistics play in this kind of behavior? I think it's a fantastic connection if there was more research that could be done with that. So there's another book I would highly recommend as well, and that's by Robert Burkhofer Jr., Cornell, MA, PhD, professor of emeritus at the University of California, Santa Cruz. But I got this book years ago, decades ago. He was a professor at the University of Michigan, but apparently retired out of the University of California, Santa Cruz. He deals with American Indian stereotypes. White Man's Indian has written an impressive documented account of self-serving stereotypes Europeans and white Americans have concocted about the Indian: noble savage, bloodthirsty redskin, he was deemed inferior in the light of Western Christian civilization and manipulated to its benefit. A thought-provoking and revelatory study of the absolute seemingly I can't get that word out. Well, I got it earlier, but I'm having trouble now. Pervasive of the white racism. The White Man's Indian is truly an important book, which penetrates to the very heart of our understanding of ourselves. It's an excellent book. And another one I recommend, I didn't put up here, is by Dr. June Nichols, which is White Captives. And she goes into that in some detail as well. And so that's another book. Nichols, N-A-M-I-A-S, Harvard, and Brandeis is where she got her PhD. Oh, I think University of Michigan, bachelor, Harvard, master's, Brandeis, PhD. But just excellent sources if you want to go on further. And, you know, I can't believe this, but I ran out of time. So I think we need, I planned to open this up earlier, but then I got so involved in this stuff, I forgot. So, but if there are any questions, comments, or further discussion, I'd be glad to welcome anything that you would like to bring in.
Gil, Judy Kirk asked in the chat box, doesn't our democracy depend on bottom-up, one vote, one person for representative and senators system?
Yes, I think that was the intent, but we don't have an even distribution of power. Like if you look at, instead of the consensus building, we vote yes, no. That takes it out. Then we have people like, if you think about the most powerful people in Congress, I'll just give an example, like the Speaker of the House. These certain people can control what bills really come to the front for discussion and vote. Then you have, excuse me, you have one man in the executive branch, which has tremendous control over that entire branch. Then you have extremely wealthy citizens. And I'll mention the Kochs, the Koch family. They used to be brothers. One of the brothers passed on not too long ago. So there's one brother left, but the Koch family, tremendous influence. So there's an influence of wealth. Then you have an organization, Citizens United, which can have certain funds, donated out of the Citizens United. Then the record shows this one organization, but not the individuals who are putting a lot of money into it. So you don't really have an even distribution of power, partly because of the financial structure of the country and how it's built. The other thing is the founding fathers, when they set this up, remember, put it in context, they're coming from a monarchy. And so in their view, which would be a logical view, we're going to create a system that takes the monarchy out of the picture and redistributes the power to a greater extent, which they did do. But they didn't extend it all the way to where every individual in the community has equal power. So they also looked around, and are we going to trust? Look at all the indentured servants now that are gaining their freedom. Can we trust them to make wise decisions? You have this kind of consideration, you know, while they're in Philadelphia trying to put this together. And so then they're beginning to think the Federalists against, say, the other people like Jefferson and so on. Then you have the Federalists, and we still have the Federalists today. And they kind of unite with the slave owner factions in the South, and they come up with the Electoral College. And the Electoral College votes for the president. I don't vote for the president. I cast my vote, which is supposed to influence the Electoral College, but they're not bound by that influence. So the Founding Fathers saw that as a way of protecting the system, the three, division of power system, by protecting the executive branch to make sure that the Electoral College made a wise decision and went ahead and put them in. I can vote for the president, but it doesn't hold weight unless my vote influences my representative in the Electoral College. But that's up to that representative. It doesn't have to. So there are a lot of mechanisms the Founding Fathers put in there kind of as a safety, but you got to realize where they're coming from and realize the context out of which they were writing. First from a monarchy they're trying to get free from. They want greater powers distributed. So they decided how far they wanted that distributed. They didn't want it to go all the way to native distribution of consensus building. And I'm not sure they fully understood the native system at that time. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, Judy. Kind of a long explanation, so.
Gil, this is Alan. I'd like to take issue with your interpretation of 17th century English history. I think that the English Civil Wars in the middle of the century, and then the Revolution of 1688, and the passing of the Charter of Rights the next year in 1689, meant that from that point on, there was absolutely no question that Parliament was supreme. William of Orange was hired as joint monarch.
Right.
He was hired by Parliament, which a generation and a half earlier had executed his father.
Right.
Not William of Orange's father, but James II.
Charles II.
Yeah, and then they booted James out of the country.
Yeah.
So, I think after 1688, 89, after the revolution of...
Yeah, James II, I think you're right, yeah.
Yeah, that there was no question but that Parliament was supreme. That's not to argue that Parliament was a democratic institution. The franchise was very restricted, very varied, very complicated.
Right.
Until they began broadening it in the 19th century with the Reform Acts of 1832 and 67 and so on. And then finally in 1918 when they began bringing the vote to women. But again, that's not to say that England was a democracy in the late 17th and 18th centuries. But I think Parliament was supreme. And at the time of the American Revolution, while the king was the symbol of the government, just as now they talk about the crown lands, crown this, you do this and that in the name of Queen Elizabeth and all that. The actual power has rested with Parliament through the 18th century and down to the present. which isn't to say anything about the virtues or the evils of the British government, but just that it really wasn't anything like an absolute monarchy after 1688.
Mhm.
James I tried to make it back into one, and that's when Parliament threw him out of the country
Right.
and hired William and Mary.
Right. I think the democracy in England was an evolutionary process.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times there was 2 steps forward, 1 back, and 2 forward, 1 back, and then
Yep.
so, and then you get into looking at how we define Parliament, and how we define the House of Lords and House of Commons, and
Yep.
how that division of power was evolving between these 2 houses, I think, is a critical issue. And then when you have Anne followed William and Mary temporarily, who was also a Stuart, but then you have the Hanoverians coming in, and to look carefully at how the Hanoverians, what their source of power was and that kind of thing. I think that's an excellent point, because things don't happen, just suddenly. That this is all in process and is kind of an evolutionary process of development. And I think it'd be in going into this topic, this subject, to begin to look at the relationship between the House of Commons and really representing the growing commercial class and the tensions going on in England at that time and their relationship to the House of Lords, and the fact that we're moving in this more and more representative government, you also have a countervailing force attempting to maintain the power, like that. And so you have to look at how successful each side was at any particular given point in time. But yeah, I like your comments and your ideas, because this is
The religious question comes into what to do about the Catholics. The Stuarts were Catholics.
right, exactly.
Yeah, complicated.
It gets really complicated, and the Tudors and where they stood, and then the Catholic, coming back with that, and so on. But it's really interesting, this human dynamics that you get.
Gil, I have a question for
Yeah.
you. If the native peoples groups had grown to populations of 1 million, 100 million, 300 million, how would their governance have changed?
Well, that's a good question too, because that raises a really important question. Can you have a consensus building form of democracy with larger groups of people? And there's a challenge there to have a larger group of people. And once you draw borders, you create the borders and set up a system, is a consensus building democracy workable? And so, Bill, you bring up a really key point here, because it would be workable if we subdivided. In other words, these superpower states we got, like the US and Russia and China and so on. That may mean that we need to deconstruct these superpowers down into smaller units. I'm not sure how that would work.
But I suspect the smaller unit is counted in hundreds at most.
A lot of them are in the thousands of the consensus builders, but it's a lot like the Osage, the example that we talked about a little earlier. The supreme And this is true of the Iroquois, which kind of gets me when people start talking about the Iroquois Empire, you know, because in order to have an empire, you have to have a strong centralization of government. But when the Osage did not have a central authority, not even in the towns hardly. They had people that were organizational in nature and that kind of thing. So that their job was more an organizational job rather than an authoritarian kind of a job, because the authority came out of the clan system, the lineage system. So if you have an Osage town, you have another Osage town, there's no central authority that unifies them at all. But what did unify them was how the marriage arrangements operated. For example, you had the Bear clan, and it didn't represent a bear. It represented the powers that a bear represents. So you may have a daughter that married somebody in another town, and so now you have an intertwining of relationships that are going on between the whole towns. That was the main unifying force of the Osage towns. So that if one was in trouble, the other towns felt compelled to come in and help them out. And that's how it actually worked that way. There was no president or no chief over the Osage. But there were such tight ties and cultural significance among them that they automatically were there for each other as a one unit. They operated in spite of that as a single unit. But yeah, these different human organizations, I think we'll get a little more into that next week too. But these are really good discussion points.
Gil, have you read Mutant Message Down Under?
No.
You might be really interested in that. It's about a lady from Kansas City, a white lady, who goes to do a walkabout with the Aborigines in Australia. And it's really fascinating. You would love it.
What's the name of it again?
Mutant Message Down Under.
Okay.
And I've heard a couple examples, that one, and then also the shamans in Peru and up high in the Andes. They live way, way up high. They're dying out, and the shamans have been told to give the information, their wisdom, to the white people, because they're all dying out, and they don't want all of their wisdom to just die out with them.
Right,
which I think is kind of fascinating. So I appreciate your interest in all this too. And the same with the Aborigines, were trying to give their wisdom to this woman from Kansas City, and she wrote this book, and I've read it a few times. It just really moves me. It's really inspirational in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Wendy. I appreciate that. My youngest son and I visited the Peru some years ago, and up in the Andes. It's fascinating. I was fascinated by the variety of foods in the small town markets and things like that they had. Potatoes, all kinds of potatoes. My gosh, not very big. They were all different colors and so on. But thank you, Wendy, for that.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, thanks for listening and coming. And again, thank you, Lori.